Why do humans cooperate with each other? I asked you this earlier this year, and we discussed why humans work together and how do we work together. And a lot of you talked about we need to get things done, we need to survive, and we can be much more productive and maybe even more powerful or secure when we work together. So, in many ways, modern world history is the history of how humans organize themselves and cooperate. And our cooperation networks have gotten more complex, but it's all about, at the bottom, it's all about how we cooperate and work with each other and organize each other. And we talked about the work earlier of Yuval Noah Harari in his book Sapiens. He talks about a great deal about human cooperation. Now, he stresses, as we talked about, that it's not always voluntary. In many cases, it's not at all voluntary, and people throughout human history have been compelled or coerced into obeying certain leaders. But these are still cooperation networks that run society. In many cases, they are hardly ever egalitarian. Now, just to recall, vocab egalitarian is the idea that all people are equal and they deserve equal rights and opportunities. In the modern era, we have these ideals espoused and written in our founding documents, but for most of human history, our human cooperation networks were hierarchical, where you had one person on top or a group of people on top controlling the many people below. But those cooperation networks built the pyramids and the Roman Empire and many of the empires of the past. Now, Harari talks about cooperation networks and human cooperation networks that are driven by these imagined orders. In many cases, it's a religious belief that drove a society to kind of follow certain rules and work together. In modern day, it's democratic societies or the belief in a constitutional government or belief in money, which is something we've invented that has no actual intrinsic value except that we've imagined the system of exchange with money and we then gave it value. So while these orders are imagined, they're actually real because we all agree to buy into it. This is what many people in the Enlightenment call social contract. This contract between all of us. What is it? It's agreeing to live by a set of rules and accept punishment for violation of those social rules. The social contract idea aids in human cooperation. We all kind of tacitly agree with a certain way of living, and therefore we can all get along and work together. This social contract, according to Harari, is an imagined order. We've decided as humans to develop a story to live by, and we all live by that. Again, if it's the story of God, if it's the story of money, we live by these things. Now, even though they're imagined, we've made them up. There's nothing physical about them. They are real because we all have this in our collective imagination. We all believe in the power of money to buy us things, to gain us access to stuff. In many cases, we still believe in religion, but in a different time, religion was followed by almost everybody, and therefore it drove people's behaviors and kept them acting in a certain way. Again, an imagined order, a social contract works because the majority of the population believes in it, and those who don't are punished or ostracized for it. Social. Now, this imagined order asks several questions. When you're thinking about this imagined order, how should humans organize themselves? How much power should a government or leading group have? Should all people be treated equally? Should all people be promised so-called rights? What should these rights be if we are to be guaranteed by rights? How much power should people give up to the social contract in exchange for protection? So in order for order, security, and protection, we may have to give up some of our liberties. We can't just do whatever the heck we want. Now, the big inquiry question that we've been dealing with this past unit in this game is, why did we decide to abandon monarchy in the days of kings and queens in favor of democracy or a more democratic society? In most of the modern world today, people have some level of voting rights and say over their lives. Why did we, for hundreds of years, go from monarchy and in the course of about 100 years transition to democracy? How did this happen? That's the big modern world history question. The more short-term question is going to be specifically about France. But right now, just think the big picture. Why in the 17 and 1800s did monarchy begin to fade in favor of democracy? Now, what we're going to see as we enter the 1800s now in France and all over the world is a new set of ideas, these new imagined orders. So again, time frame, big picture, talking 1700s into the 1800s. Remember the French Revolution we just finished is 1789 into 1800s. And what's going on? Well, we have background, we got the Industrial Revolution happening, and that's changing the economy, and it's having a profound effect on society and the government around them. So some new orders we have are the idea of liberalism, and this is not to be confused with today's modern idea of liberals, as in America, the Democratic Party tends to be the liberal party. This is a little bit different. Liberalism is an emerging belief that's challenging the idea of monarchies and kings. Liberals of the 1800s believe in two things primarily: the free market capitalist economy, in which middle class individuals can own and sell goods on a free market without regulations, without the monarchies telling them and controlling them what to bake. And it's also the belief in a bourgeoisie capitalism, a middle class, propertied, stable group of people who vote in leaders in a legislative Congress branch, or even the leaders themselves, the kings themselves. But it's where the respectable kind of new order revolves around respectable business people, property classes who have a say over what goes on in their country. And this brings us to democratic societies and free market capitalism. And again, if you think about the context, you have to have a growing middle class big enough to push these things to even get any of this stuff passed. And if you remember, the Industrial Revolution creates the middle class. Now, you also have the rise of something called nationalism. Nationalism is the belief in society being organized around ethnic groups or some sort of shared national heritage. What makes us alike? And so if you look at the map of Europe at the time, for example, you have the kingdoms, the Kingdom of Spain, the Kingdom of France. If you look at that big yellow one, it's the Empire of Austria. In the Empire of Austria, there are 10, 11, 13 different ethnic groups, nationalities, what they eventually are called. If you look at the big red zone there, those are all German-speaking peoples. They share kind of a Germanic heritage, but they're all in their different kingdoms. If you look down in Italy, the boot there, they're all different kingdoms. They're not a united country. Nationalism is the belief that we take these various groups and organize them around ethnicity, around a language group or culture. And that begins to break up and challenge the empires and the kings. We'll talk about that a bit later. And the other thing that begins to emerge is this idea of socialism, in which everybody has a say over the economic gains of the country, in which property and wealth is managed collectively together for the benefit of society. It's almost like democracy or democratic control over the economy, over the workplace, over property. And this is considered quite radical even today, and it certainly was radical during the Industrial Revolution, but it begins to come in. It also challenges kings, but it also challenges liberal capitalism as well. So we're going to see these isms play out. So keep in mind the growing democratic liberalism, nationalism, and socialism. Here's the socialism. Socialist workers fighting for their right. And this, of course, leads to conflict. All of these things lead to conflict. Kings are not going to want to give up their power to middle-class democratic folks. The nationalists who want a Germany united for Germany are going to clash up against local princes who have their own little kingdoms. And the socialist worker movements are going to clash up against not only kings, but also the middle-class business people. Keep that in the background. The more immediate short-term question for this video is, why was the French king forced to flee in 1830? Now we're looking at 1830, guys. This is like 40 years after the French Revolution got started. So this is sometime after the French Revolution, but it's still within memory. If you were living in 1830, this would be thinking like, the 1970s are today. All right, so like your parents would definitely been around back then, and they've been young, but they would still remember, and your grandparents would have lived through the French Revolution. So there's echoes of this in the French people. And there's a French king, 1830, and why was he forced to flee? Let's get some background. Revolution recap, right? You guys, just in case you forgot, right? We had, for hundreds of years, the Bourbon dynasty leading France in the 16 and 1700s. Even before that, it was an absolute monarchy where the king's word was law, and this was often described as the ancient regime, the old way of doing things. But revolution sparks in 1789, and it brings a whole bunch of things happening. The cause as well. We have the Enlightenment ideas beginning to challenge the idea of an absolute monarch. John Locke, right? Montesquieu, the balance of power. The American Revolution happens in the 1770s, and this shows the idea that a republic could be possible. And more immediate cause, and probably the primary cause, is the fact that you have a rising middle class who is still part of that third estate, who has no say over things. They want more say. And the king finds themselves in economic troubles, completely bankrupt, and needs help from the middle class. And the middle class is not willing to help out unless they get a say finally, right? The third estate gets a say. And enough people in the third estate, from the poor peasants to the middle class, begin to be tired of the government's corruption, or the perceived corruption and the perceived incompetence of the government. So, revolution happens. I won't go over all the details. You guys probably remember that. You can always watch the video in the Google input below this. But what we do know is that the rest of Europe gets freaked out because they're all kings. They don't want to be taken over by this new revolutionary wave. And so they set out to smother this revolution. And France goes on the offensive and tries to defend itself and then go a bit further. Under the able leadership of Napoleon Bonaparte, France takes on most of Europe, and this has been known as the Napoleonic Wars. Now, during the Napoleonic Wars, at France's height, France occupies almost all of Europe. Take a look at this, right? France is either directly rules the blue areas, or the light blue states have leaders that are pledging their allegiance to France and Napoleon, and the purple states are independent, but they're allied. So France and this Napoleonic order of, he's an emperor, but he also has these new ideas of like equality before the law and education for everybody. These more democratic ideals are spreading throughout Europe. Now, eventually, he gets stretched too thin. He basically tries to invade Russia. Winter comes in and ends up killing a lot of Napoleon's army, and he's forced to retreat. Skimming some of the details, Napoleon is defeated in 1814, and look how upset he looks here. Now, to settle the whole mess of these years of the Napoleonic Wars, the heads of all the states meet in Vienna, and this is known as the Congress of Vienna. This is the thing you got to remember. Congress of Vienna, it sets up all of the 1800s in the modern era. It takes place in 1815. And it's led primarily by Austrian's foreign minister, Clemens von Metternich. And Metternich is a super conservative guy. He fears the people. He fears democracy. He feels that democracy to him is a bad word. He feels it will lead to chaos and disorder. Just look at the Reign of Terror. That is what will happen if we let the people who don't know what they're talking about take control of society. So the Congress of Vienna under Metternich's leadership has two goals. Hint, hint, this is one of your questions. It's to reduce France's power back to its original borders pre-revolution, and to put the old monarchies back in power, to restore that ancient regime, to turn back the clock and make it to a more stable society the way it had been for hundreds of years, to put a squash on the revolutionary fever. Now, in France, what this means is the Bourbon dynasty that ruled before the French Revolution gets restored. This is known as the Bourbon Restoration. Now, again, remember, a lot of the nobles and a lot of the Bourbon family had been beheaded. So they find a relative of the Bourbon dynasty, this guy who's crowned Louis XVIII. And there's a picture of him right there. And the French accept this. Why, after all these years of revolution, would they accept a monarchy? Well, besides being defeated in war, Metternich is smart. Metternich makes it a constitutional monarchy. So they'll say, we're not going to give you an absolute monarchy. It's going to be a monarchy with a legislative branch, and the people will be guaranteed certain rights. We're not going to completely turn the clock back. And the people of France are willing to accept this. Now, Louis XVIII that we just showed there, he dies, and his brother, Charles X, the Comte de Troyes was his official title, he takes throne. And if you look at just the way he's pictured here, you can tell he's not a man of the people, right? He looks just like Louis XVI before the Revolution. Now, he takes power. His goal is to set things back the way they were. None of this constitutional monarchy. He wants to create an absolute monarchy. He's still living in the old age and can't get his head around the fact that the people might have a say. So with the support of the ultra-royalists, those in French society who want the clock to go back to the pre-1789 days, these guys, Charles and the ultra-royalists, set out to create an absolute monarchy. Now, remember, the short-term question was, why was the French king forced to flee in 1830? It's this Charles guy who we're talking about here. Now, Charles leads for a few years until what is known as the July Crisis of 1830. Now, some background here. There was an economic crisis in the late 1820s. People were hungry, and many people were without a job. It's in this context that Charles tries to restore the land of the nobles. So we're talking the nobles who left France, many of the emigres who left during the Revolution. They want their land back. They said, look, all these people, the peasants took my land during the Great Fear and all this stuff in the Revolution. We want our land back. And so he puts forward a bill to restore the land of the nobles. This does not fly, and the liberal legislature, remember, it's still a constitutional monarchy at this point. The liberal legislature says no, right? And this is supposed to work that, well, if the legislature says no, they got to work out a deal. This is a constitutional monarchy. This is post-French Revolution. You can't go back to the way it was. What happens is Charles instigates the July Revolution by accident here. What he does is he passes the July Ordinance. What were these July Ordinances? He says, you know what? Fine, legislator, you don't agree with me, you are now fired. He ends the legislature. He says, I'm going to hold new elections. He then greatly restricts the press. He was a very he's a prickly fellow with thin skin, and he hated the fact that the press could question him and challenge him. This is sort of the equivalent of like President Trump today talking about fake news. He gets very upset when the press challenges him. Charles X could not stand the fact that the press might say anything bad about him, and so he said anything that is printed must be run through his censors first, and so the freedom of the press was destroyed because the press was quite critical of him. And he greatly restricts voting rights to the upper echelons of society. What happens is the people, they say, no, we're not doing this. This is not the absolute monarch. You can't get away with this. And in July, after he issues these July ordinances, Parisians take to the street and revolt against King Charles. And for 3 days, they basically set up barricades and occupy the main neighborhood of Paris. And until Charles realizes he has no control over the society and he flees. The liberals select a new king. There's some discussion about maybe making a republic, but the last time they did that, remember, all of Europe declared war on them. It was a big mess, the reign of terror. So modern liberals, kind of middle-class folks who are in the legislature, select a new king. And Charles X flees to England, hangs out, gone. Now, the aftermath of this is you have some sporadic fighting with those who want to create a republic and go farther. The new government squashes them fairly quickly. There's not a lot of widespread support for that. There's fears of invasions. Remember last time we created a republic, Austria invaded us. It was a mess, and that was enough. Those fears were enough to keep people in support of just a new king. Let's try a new king. And they select this guy, the Duke of Orleans, or King Louis Philippe. Now, this guy was a distant cousin of Charles. They were in the family, but he was of the Orleanist dynasty. And so he was considered different enough, and he was more considered middle-class bourgeois of the modern era. So they now, what you should also know, larger context. Once the revolution happened in 1830, the cat was out of the bag. No more people are going to accept this. In 1830s, after France kicks out Charles X, Spain has a rise of liberals who challenge the monarchy in Spain. There's no revolution yet, but they begin to challenge absolute monarchy in Spain. In Greece, which was controlled by the Turkish Ottoman Empire, they rise up against the Turks and are successful. The Poles in what is now Poland rise up against the Russians. This gets crushed, but again, it's beginning to have these sparks of revolution. In England, the British are fearing revolution, so they begin to pass a whole bunch of reforms that give voting rights to people. In the United States, this is the age of Andrew Jackson and the democratic reform happening in the U.S., where people in the U.S. are now able to vote, even if they don't own lots of property. Now, where do we go from here? Well, the French you have the moderate liberals, those middle-class liberals who want a liberal aristocracy. They want voting rights, but they're okay with the king. You have the radicals, the sort of group C and A in our game here. Now, these are lower middle class. These are some newer bourgeoisie who are recently working class, who they want more share over the economy as well. They want to go far. They want a republic. Some of them even want socialism. And the socialist movement is still small, but it's the growing working class movements that wants control over the factories. These guys are at odds with the king, but they're also at odds with these moderate liberals who often own the industry. So we have some tension in society, but they all agreed the king needed to go, and we have to have a constitutional monarchy. Now, revolutionary leaders, both liberals and socialists, set up a new constitutional monarchy, and they have their hopes with this Louis Philippe. Louis Philippe was known as the citizen king. If you look at him here, he's dressed in like a suit and tie more than the robes. He's considered a middle-class futuristic guy. And the hopes is this will be a stable solution to our problem, a balance between monarchy and republic with this constitutional monarchy, in which there's a legislature, a constitution guaranteeing people's rights, and a monarchy. Now, this sort of sums up after Charles was gone. This says, Frenchmen, France is free. The absolute power was raising its flag. The heroic population of Paris overthrew it. No more fear for our rights. No further barrier between us and the rights which still lack. Louis Philippe will respect our rights, for he will hold his from us. We shall assure ourselves by laws all the necessary guarantees in order to render liberty strong and durable. They had total faith that this Louis Philippe was going to respect their rights. He was going to hold back his rights, hold back his power, and in order to protect the liberty of the people, unlike this Charles X guy. So what we're going to see, there's a momentum in France to go towards democracy, towards more people having a say than absolute monarchy. And when Charles X tried to do that, they said, we're going to raise our flag and we're going to overthrow it. Citizen King, here's the answer to our solutions. It's the 1830s now. We have a constitutional monarchy in France. Now, remember, the short-term question that you also are asked to address on your sheet. Why couldn't Charles hold on to power? Why was he overthrown in France? So try and figure that out. And tomorrow we'll talk about this Louis Philippe guy. Think about the lessons learned in our game. If you're the government group, what might you have learned from this event? What could have Charles done to prevent this? Activist groups A, B, and C. What might you have learned from this event? Again, Group A, Group C, you guys are more along the radical lower middle class, working class. You'd probably be aligned with which groups? The moderates, the socialists. The Group B, you want democracy, but you don't want it to go too far. So think about the lessons, and then and we'll talk about it tomorrow.